Bill scanned the perimeter of the orchard, his pulse quickening when he saw the coast was clear. He leaned his beat-up pickup against an old oak tree, the shade offering meager cover in the midday sun. Carol's farmhouse stood silent in the distance, only the kitchen window aglow with a soft, inviting light. Henry must be sleeping soundly, he figured, his illness making him a prisoner in his own home. He approached the house with a practiced stealth, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. Peering through the kitchen window, he saw Carol's silhouette hunched over the counter, her blonde hair shining like spun gold in the lamplight. He rapped lightly on the windowpane. "Carol, it's Bill." She whirled around, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of surprise. "Bill, you scared the daylights out of me. What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a mix of apprehension and something else. Something that made the air crackle with a strange electricity. "Just thought I'd see how you and Henry were doing," he said, his gaze lingering on the way her thin cotton blouse clung to her curves. "Henry still sleeping?" "Soundly," she confirmed, her eyes darting nervously towards the hallway. "He's been out since breakfast. You know how it is." "Yeah," he murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, why don't I run along, and you can meet me down by the lake cabin tomorrow afternoon? Say around 2? Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear quickly replaced by a hesitant smile. "Bill, I don't know," she began, but her voice lacked conviction. "Come on, Carol," he urged, moving closer to the window. "Just a couple of hours. Nobody needs to know." She hesitated for a beat, her breath catching in her throat. All right, she conceded, her voice barely a whisper. "But you be careful getting out of here. If Henry wakes up..." He didn't need to be told twice. Bill slipped away from the house as quietly as he'd come, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could still feel the heat of Carol's gaze on his back, and the anticipation of their next meeting was a sweet, forbidden ache in his gut. The thrill of their clandestine affair both exhilarated and terrified Carol. She relished the stolen moments with Bill, the way he made her feel alive and desired again after years of neglect. But the guilt gnawed at her conscience, a constant reminder of the betrayal she inflicted upon Henry with every encounter. There were times she wanted to end it, to walk away from the dangerous game they were playing. But Bill had a way of chipping away at her resolve, of reawakening the longing deep within her that Henry, with his failing health and fading affections, had long ignored. It had all started a few months back, shortly after Henry's stroke. The responsibility of running the orchard fell solely on Carol's shoulders. One sweltering afternoon in June, while tending to the apple trees near the lake, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She collapsed onto the warm earth, her vision blurring at the edges. When she came to, she was sprawled on the worn cot inside Bill's cabin, a damp cloth pressed against her forehead. Bill sat beside her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite place. "Bill?" she croaked, her voice raspy. "What happened?" "You fainted," he said gently. "Heat stroke, I reckon. I saw you lying there when I came down to check on the fishing lines." Carol struggled to sit up, her head swimming with a dull ache. "How long was I out?" "Not long," he lied, his gaze sweeping over her. "You just need to rest for a bit. I'll drive you back to the house later." She looked down at herself, her cheeks flooding with heat. Her sweat-soaked shirt and shorts had been removed, leaving her clad only in her thin cotton bra and panties. "My clothes?" she stammered, mortified. "Had to get you out of that wet stuff," he said smoothly, his eyes lingering on the expanse of her bare legs. "Didn't want you catching a chill." The way he looked at her, a hungry glint in his eyes, sent a shiver down her spine. A mixture of fear and something else, something intoxicating and dangerous, coursed through her veins. Carol's cheeks burned as she quickly sat up, pulling her shirt down and tugging her shorts back into place. "Bill, I don't know what to say. This is so embarrassing. A woman my age." He chuckled, his hand resting lightly on her knee, sending a jolt of heat straight to her core. "Honey, at this point in life, what's there to be embarrassed about? It's not like I haven't seen it all before." His words, meant to be reassuring, only made her blush deepen. "That's not the point, Bill. I'm a married woman." He leaned closer, his gaze intense. "You know, you don't look a day over 40. Carol forced a laugh, though her insides were churning with a mixture of guilt and a strange, unexpected thrill. "Don't be silly, Bill. I'll be 50 next year." "I'm serious," he insisted. "You've got that youthful glow about you. Linda's the same age, but you'd think she was 60 the way she carries on." Bill's eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, seemed to devour her whole. Carol found herself both flattered and unnerved by his attention. Had he always looked at her this way, with a hunger that sent a tremor through her very being? A terrifying thought crossed her mind. Had he done more than just remove her wet clothes while she was unconscious? "Oh, stop it, you," Carol said, attempting to deflect his compliment with a self-deprecating laugh. "This old thing? I'm practically ancient. Next year you'll have to start calling me Grandma Carol," she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Between the orchard and Henry, I barely have time to shower, let alone worry about looking young." A shadow passed over Bill's face. "Speaking of Henry, how is he doing? Any better?" "The doctors say he's stable," Carol replied, her voice losing some of its forced cheerfulness. "But he's still weak, can't do much for himself. Jason helps out when he can, but the boy's got his own life, his own family to take care of. It's a lot, to be honest." "It's tough, that's for sure," Bill agreed, his eyes still holding that unnerving intensity. "A woman like you stuck at home taking care of a sick husband? It ain't right." He paused, his gaze raking over her with a hunger that made her skin tingle. "A woman needs." He hesitated, seemingly searching for the right words. "A woman needs certain things, you know, certain attentions." The implication hung heavy in the air between them, sending a shiver down Carol's spine. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a strange alertness take hold. Bill wasn't being subtle anymore, and a part of her, a dark and long dormant part, was responding. "Bill, don't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to stand, but her legs felt shaky beneath her. He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about, Carol," he murmured, his voice a low growl. "I can see it in your eyes. You miss it, just like I do." Her breath hitched in her throat. He was right. She did miss it. The intimacy, the touch of a man's hand, the feeling of being desired. It had been so long. I should get back," she murmured, pushing weakly against his chest. But her attempt to rise only sent a wave of dizziness crashing over her, and she would have tumbled back onto the cot if Bill hadn't caught her. He gathered her close, his arms surprisingly strong around her. "Easy there, darlin'," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You're still not yourself. Lie back, rest a while longer." She yielded to his embrace, her body molding against his as if it belonged there. "I can't stay, Bill," she protested, though her voice lacked any real heat. "Henry." "Henry's fine," he said, stroking her hair with surprising tenderness. "Emily's probably already there, fussing over him. You pushing yourself ain't gonna help anything." He stood, pulling her up with him. "How about some lemonade? That'll perk you right up." Before she could object, he was already mixing up a glass in the small kitchenette. "It's good to finally have a real conversation with you, Carol," he said, his voice taking on a wistful tone. "We've lived in the same town all these years, but it feels like I'm just now getting to know you." She accepted the glass from him, her fingers brushing his, and a jolt of awareness shot through her. "It's just strange, being here with you like this," she admitted, her gaze flitting around the small cabin. "What if Linda were to walk in?" He scoffed, a harsh sound. "Linda wouldn't know what to do with herself if she caught me doing something as exciting as talking to another woman." He leaned closer, his eyes locking with hers. "Pretend I'm Henry, for just a little while. Pretend you actually want to be here with me." She met his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was playing with fire, and a dangerous part of her wanted to get burned. Obediently, she took a sip of the lemonade, the tartness surprisingly refreshing. Carol found herself oddly charmed by Bill's attentiveness. He was like a different person here at the cabin, away from the prying eyes of the town. Where was this tenderness, this almost shy concern, when he was at home with Linda? Or was it all an act, a way to lure unsuspecting women into his web? She had heard the whispers about Bill's reputation, of course. How could she not, in a town where secrets were as plentiful as apples on a summer day? He was a charmer, no doubt, with a quick smile and an even quicker way with words. Linda, a stern, church-going woman, always seemed to be the last to know about her husband's indiscretions. Carol had never considered herself the type to fall for a man like Bill. She had Henry, for better or worse. They had built a life together, raised a family. But lately, with Henry's illness casting a long shadow over everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her had gone dormant, starved for the kind of attention that Henry, in his current state, could no longer provide. And Bill, with his roguish charm and that hungry look in his eyes, seemed determined to awaken that dormant part of her, whether she wanted him to or not. It wasn't just Bill's charm that drew the eye. Carol, despite her age, possessed a timeless beauty, a quiet sensuality that whispered beneath the surface of her practical, hard-working demeanor. Her figure was lean and strong from years of tending the orchard, her skin tanned and smooth, with only the faintest hint of wrinkles around her bright blue eyes. Those eyes, framed by long, dark lashes, held a spark of mischief that belied her quiet nature. Bill had noticed her, of course. He'd be blind not to. He'd caught himself watching her more times than he could count, admiring the way she moved through the orchard with an effortless grace, her laughter echoing through the trees like a summer breeze. But with Henry always by her side, he'd kept his distance, his admiration remaining a silent, unspoken thing. Until now. Carol finished her lemonade, feeling more alert than she had in hours. She watched as Bill busied himself with preparing a plate of instant ramen noodles, a small act of domesticity that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "This is really too much trouble, Bill," she said, a twinge of guilt resurfacing. "Here I am, barging into your cabin, making you miss lunch." He grinned, his teeth flashing white against his tanned skin. "Don't you worry about me, darlin'. I'm happy to feed a beautiful woman in need." He winked. "So how are you going to repay me for all this hospitality?" She laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even her. "What would you say to a lifetime supply of apple pie?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "As tempting as that sounds, I had something else in mind." His gaze settled on her, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Let's just say I have a particular weakness for beautiful women, especially ones with eyes like yours." "Don't flatter me, Bill," Carol said, her cheeks warm beneath his gaze. "At my age, who am I to be compared to younger women?" She gestured toward the door, feigning offense. "Besides, I'm a happily married woman. You watch your words, mister." He chuckled, leaning closer so that she could smell the scent of pine needles and lake water clinging to his flannel shirt. "Happily married, huh? That's what they all say." He winked. "Look, Carol, I'm not gonna lie to you. You're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen, and I know a thing or two about beautiful women." She couldn't help but be flattered, even if a part of her knew she should be outraged by his boldness. "That's quite a reputation you've got there, Bill," she said, her voice teasing. "Linda must have her hands full." He snorted. "Linda and I haven't shared a bed in years. She's got her Bible study and her garden club. I'm surprised she remembers my name half the time." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. "Don't get me wrong, Carol," he murmured, his voice low and husky. "I'm not complaining. A man's got what a man's got to do, right?" She swatted playfully at his hand, her heart pounding in her chest. He was bolder than any man she'd ever met, yet there was a strange tenderness in his touch, a vulnerability in his eyes that disarmed her. She knew she should put a stop to this, tell him to go back to his wife. But the words wouldn't come. A dangerous part of her craved his attention, the way he made her feel seen, desired, alive. "What if I told you I could make you forget all about Henry?" Bill whispered, his fingers trailing down her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. "What if I told you I could give you the kind of attention you deserve? The kind that makes you feel like a woman again, not just a tired old farmer's wife." His touch was firm yet gentle as he kneaded the tight muscles at the base of her skull. Carol closed her eyes, a soft moan escaping her lips. It felt so good, so incredibly good to be touched like this. It had been so long since she'd felt the warmth of a man's hands on her body, the strength of his touch chasing away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. A part of her knew she should pull away, tell him this was wrong. that she was a married woman, and he was no better than a common philanderer. But her body betrayed her, arching instinctively into his touch, craving more of his heat, his scent, his dangerous proximity. "That feels amazing," she breathed, her voice a husky whisper. It was true. His touch was unlocking something within her, a wellspring of longing she had kept buried for far too long. "Does it now?" he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Henry ever rub your shoulders like that?" "Henry?" She almost laughed. These days, Henry could barely lift a spoon, let alone tend to her aching muscles after a long day in the orchard. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about Henry," Bill said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver of something dangerous down her spine. "Just relax and let me take care of you." His hands were restless, straying from her neck to her shoulders, his fingers tracing the line of her collarbone with a feather-light touch that sent shivers down her spine. Carol's breath hitched in her throat, her body instinctively shrinking back from his touch, even as her mind urged her to lean closer. "Bill," she murmured, her voice breathy and unsure. "What are you doing?" A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Just making you feel good, darlin'," he whispered, his fingers finding the sensitive spot just below her ear. "Someone might see," she protested, though her voice lacked any real conviction. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her earlobe. "Let them see," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "Let them see how much you need me." The audacity of his words, the sheer impropriety of it all, sent a wave of heat coursing through her veins. This was madness, she knew that, yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. A sudden shrill ringing shattered the moment. Bill swore under his breath, reaching into his pocket to silence the insistent chime of his cell phone. "Yeah, it's me," he barked into the phone. He listened for a moment, his expression shifting from annoyance to impatience. "Linda, I told you, I'm down at the cabin. Got a hankering for some peace and quiet. You and Jason go ahead and eat without me." He hung up without waiting for a response, tossing the phone onto the table with a clatter. "Don't you need to go home?" Carol asked, her voice barely a whisper. Part of her, the sensible, responsible part, urged him to leave, to go back to his life and let her return to hers. But another part, a reckless, yearning part, didn't want him to go, not yet. "Not if I don't want to," he said, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath away. "And right now, I want to be right here with you." "Bill, Carol stammered, suddenly overwhelmed by the intimacy of the moment. He reached out, his fingers gently cupping her chin. "Don't worry, darlin'," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I won't push you further than you're ready to go." But the look in his eyes, the heat that emanated from him like the sun on a summer day, told a different story. He retrieved her clothes from the line strung across the porch, handing them to her with a playful swat on the backside. "Get yourself decent, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice thick with unspoken promises. "We wouldn't want Henry thinking I've stolen his beautiful wife." She took the clothes from him, her fingers lingering against his for a fleeting, dangerous moment. "I should go," she said again, though her voice lacked conviction. "Come back tomorrow," he whispered, his words like a caress. "Same time? I'll catch you a mess of trout. We can have ourselves a little picnic by the lake." She hesitated, torn between the fear clawing at her throat and the desire that pulsed like a drumbeat in her veins. I don't know, Bill," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Don't overthink it, Carol," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "Just let it happen." She pulled away, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was right. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led to guilt, to second thoughts. And right now, the last thing Carol wanted to do was think. The walk back to the farmhouse was a blur. She reached the porch, just as Henry was wheeling himself through the doorway, his brow furrowed with worry. "Carol, where have you been?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Emily's been gone for hours, and I was starting to worry." Guilt twisted in her gut, a sharp contrast to the warmth that still lingered on her skin from Bill's touch. "Sorry, Henry," she said, forcing a bright smile onto her face. "Got caught up talking to Martha down the road. You know how she loves to gossip." He grunted, his gaze falling to her disheveled appearance. "You look flushed," he observed, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Are you feeling all right?" Just the heat, she said quickly, averting her eyes. It's stifling out there today. Don't you dare judge me for coming back late, Henry Harper. You try picking apples in this weather. She bustled around the kitchen, the familiar routine of preparing Henry's lunch, doing little to ease the turmoil within her. She found him slumped in his wheelchair, a puddle of urine spreading across the linoleum floor. Frustration, a bitter taste in her mouth, overwhelmed her. "Henry," she cried, her voice sharp with exasperation. "Why didn't you call me?" He looked up at her, his face creased with shame. I tried, Carol," he mumbled, his voice slurred. "I just couldn't." A sob caught in her throat, but she choked it back. This was her life now, an endless cycle of caring for a man who could no longer care for himself. The unfairness of it all, the way her own needs had become secondary to his, fueled a slow-burning resentment within her. Later that night, as she lay in bed listening to Henry's labored breathing, sleep evaded her. Images of the day replayed in her mind. Bill's touch, his hungry eyes, the way her body had betrayed her with its eagerness for his touch. She hadn't felt this alive, this desirable, in years. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly addictive. Was this what it meant to be a woman of a certain age? To crave the attention of a man like Bill, a man who was both forbidden and irresistible? By morning, her mind was made up. She dressed carefully, choosing a pair of faded denim shorts and a sleeveless blouse that showed off the curve of her arms. As she headed towards the orchard, she couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. She was playing a dangerous game, she knew that. But for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. She didn't bother with her usual work clothes, choosing instead a loose-fitting sundress that flowed around her like a summer breeze. Her hair, freshly washed and smelling faintly of lavender, framed her face in soft waves. As she strolled towards the lake, she could feel Bill's eyes on her, hot and heavy like the midday sun. He met her by the boathouse, a wide grin splitting his face. "Well, now look what the cat dragged in," he drawled, his gaze sweeping over her with undisguised appreciation. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you were dressed to impress." Carol blushed, feigning indifference. "Don't be silly, Bill." She chided, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Just out for a stroll, admiring the view." She gestured vaguely towards the shimmering surface of the lake. "Beautiful day for it, isn't it?" He chuckled, not bothering to hide his amusement at her clumsy attempt at deception. "Sure, Carol, sure," he said, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, his palm rough against her skin, and the warmth of his touch spread through her like a shot of whiskey. He led her towards the cabin, his fingers entwined with hers. Carol followed willingly, her heart pounding a wild tattoo against her ribs. Inside, the air was cool and dim, a welcome respite from the heat of the day. "You look good, Carol," Bill said, his voice husky as he handed her a glass of iced tea. "Real good." She blushed again, flustered by the intensity of his gaze. "You're just trying to butter me up for more apple pie," she teased, her voice trembling slightly. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "Honey, with you, I don't need any buttering up." His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held hers captive. "So, tell me," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "what are your feelings for me?" "Don't be ridiculous, Bill," Carol said, pushing lightly against his chest, though her heart wasn't in it. "It's just gratitude, that's all. You helped me the other day, and I—" Her voice trailed off, her resolve crumbling beneath his intense gaze. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Gratitude, huh? That's one word for it." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her earlobe. "But I think there's something else there, Carol. Something wilder. Something you've been trying to ignore for a long, long time." He was right, of course. Carol had known, deep down, what she was walking into when she'd put on her prettiest sundress and followed the path to his cabin. The truth was, she wanted this, craved it with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. The air crackled with unspoken desire as their gazes locked, a silent conversation passing between them. Bill made no attempt to hide his hunger, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking the corner of her mouth. "Let me take care of you, Carol," he murmured, his voice a husky whisper against her skin. "Let me show you what you've been missing." Her protests died on her lips as his mouth descended on hers, his kiss both demanding and tender, awakening a longing within her that she had long forgotten existed. His hands were everywhere, pulling her closer, urging her to surrender to the heat that blazed between them. "Bill?" she breathed, her voice a helpless moan against his lips. He chuckled, a sound of pure male satisfaction, and then his mouth was on hers again, his kiss deepening, consuming, stealing the very breath from her lungs. She was falling, tumbling headlong into a whirlpool of desire from which there was no escape. And for the first time in years, Carol didn't want to be saved. The outside world, with its obligations and expectations, faded away as Bill lowered her onto the cot. The small cabin, filled with the scent of pine and musk, became their universe, their haven from the constraints of their everyday lives. Carol surrendered to the heat of his touch, her body responding to his with an urgency that surprised even her. Years of unspoken longing, of unfulfilled desires, melted away beneath the intensity of his kiss, the strength of his hands on her skin. She lost herself in the sensations that pulsed between them, in the feel of his calloused hands against her skin, the taste of salt and desire on his lips. He was strong, insistent, yet there was a tenderness in his touch that belied his rugged exterior. "Never thought I'd find a woman like you, Carol," he murmured, his voice thick with passion, his breath hot against her ear. "A woman who could make me forget everything but this moment, right here, right now." "Don't talk," she breathed, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. Words weren't needed, not anymore. In the heat of their embrace, everything was understood, everything was forgiven. For the first time in years, Carol felt truly free, her body and soul ignited by a passion she had long thought extinguished. But as the afterglow faded, a familiar pang of guilt whispered in the back of her mind. She had crossed a line she never thought she would dare to cross. She had betrayed Henry, betrayed their years together, for a few stolen moments of pleasure. But as she met Bill's gaze, saw the tenderness in his eyes, the way his hand reached out to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek, she pushed the guilt aside. There would be time for regrets later. Right now, she wanted to savor the taste of their sin, the knowledge that even in the twilight of her years, she was capable of feeling this alive. This desire. Bill held her close, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her back, a silent question in his touch. "Was it good for you, Carol?" he asked, his voice husky with contentment. "As good as it was for me?" She met his gaze, a shy smile playing on her lips. "It was wonderful, Bill," she whispered, feeling bolder than she ever had in her life. Never, he prompted, raising an eyebrow. She blushed, burying her face in the crook of his neck. "Never mind," she mumbled. "Some things were better left unsaid," he chuckled, the sound vibrating against her skin. "Don't worry, darlin'," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "Your secrets are safe with me." They spent the rest of the afternoon tangled together in Bill's cabin, their bodies a testament to the reckless abandon that had taken hold of them both. They made love again, slow and languorous this time, as if savoring every stolen moment together. By the time Carol finally slipped away, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Their affair, once a hesitant dance of stolen glances and whispered promises, became a consuming fire. They met whenever they could, stealing moments in the orchard, by the lake, even in the shadowed corners of the local farmers' market. Carol found herself making excuses to visit the orchard more frequently, her heart quickening with anticipation at the thought of seeing Bill, of feeling his touch, his lips on hers. She was reckless, she knew that, but the guilt that had plagued her earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of exhilaration, of being truly alive for the first time in years. She was a woman reborn, her senses heightened, her body humming with a vitality she had long thought lost. But as with all fires, this one, too, threatened to burn out of control, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The whispers started subtly, hushed whispers in the aisles of the grocery store, knowing glances exchanged across the pews at Sunday service. But like a weed left untended, the rumors about Carol and Bill soon spread through their small town, taking root in the fertile ground of gossip and speculation. "Have you heard about Carol Harper?" people whispered. "They say she's carrying on with that good-for-nothing Bill Evans." "That poor Henry," others lamented, "stuck at home in his wheelchair while his wife gallivants around with another man." It wasn't long before the whispers reached the ears of Jason and Emily. "There's something going on with your mother, Jason," Emily said one evening, her brow furrowed with concern. I heard Mrs. Peterson talking about it at the post office today. Jason, ever his mother's defender, waved a dismissive hand. Don't believe everything you hear, Em. Mom would never. His voice trailed off, a flicker of doubt clouding his eyes. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her gaze earnest. Honey, I know you don't want to believe it, but there's no smoke without fire. And Bill Evans, that man has a reputation, Jason. Besides, I've seen him stopping by the house when you're not here. And your mother, she's different lately. Distant. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in Jason's gut. He loved his mother dearly, but he couldn't deny the truth in Emily's words. Carol had been distant lately, her moods unpredictable, her smiles strained. They decided to keep a watchful eye on Carol, their concern outweighing any lingering hesitation about invading her privacy. For 2 days, their vigilance yielded nothing. But on the third day, as Carol announced she was heading into town for groceries, Emily decided to follow. She watched as Carol's pickup truck turned not towards the bustling town center, but towards the dirt road leading to the lake. Emily's heart sank as she dialed her husband's number, her suspicions hardening into a bitter certainty. Jason, it's Bill's cabin, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and betrayal. She's with him, Jason. She's with him right now. Minutes later, Jason burst into the cabin, his face a mask of rage and betrayal. He found his mother and Bill locked in a tight embrace on the cot, their clothes scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The look of shame on Carol's face, the way she flinched away from her son's fury, told him everything he needed to know. Words, when they finally came, were a torrent of anger and hurt. Bill, his face pale and drawn, could only offer a mumbled apology, his bravado from moments earlier gone. In the end, it was Emily who intervened, her voice shaking with a mixture of disappointment and sadness, as she persuaded Jason to leave, to let the weight of their betrayal sink in without further spectacle. They left Carol and Bill to face the consequences of their actions. The silence in the wake of their departure, deafening. The knowledge that they had hurt the people they loved most, had shattered the fragile trust that held their family together, was a heavy burden to bear. Carol spent the next few weeks in a daze of shame and remorse. Jason, his anger slow to fade, barely spoke to her, his eyes filled with a disappointment that cut her to the core. Emily, ever practical, took over the care of Henry, her silence speaking volumes. Bill, true to his words, stayed away, the memory of their encounter a ghost that haunted the edges of her thoughts. The whispers in town continued, but they were quieter now, laced with a mixture of pity and scorn that made Carol want to disappear into the very earth itself. She threw herself into caring for Henry, her guilt a constant companion. She had betrayed him, betrayed their vows, and for what? A few stolen moments of pleasure, a fleeting glimpse of a passion that was never meant to last. The orchard, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the rustling leaves a constant reminder of her sin. She avoided the lake, the memory of Bill's touch too painful to bear. Life went on, of course, but it was a different kind of life. One shadowed by regret and the bitter knowledge that some mistakes, once made, could never be fully erased. And as the years passed, Carol learned to live with the consequences of her actions. The memory of that one reckless summer, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of trust, the devastating power of desire, and the enduring strength of family. And that, my friends, concludes our tale for today. May it serve as a reminder that even in the quietest of towns, secrets have a way of coming to light, and the choices we make, for better or worse, have lasting consequences. Until next time, take care and be true to yourselves and those you love.